In a small seaside town that seemed like the perfect place for a family vacation, strange things began to happen. For weeks, one by one, people began to go missing. First, an elderly park ranger disappeared, followed by a young street artist, then a couple of tourists. The town, once full of happy vacationers, became the center of perplexed and frightened eyes. Authorities tried to calm the panic by assuring that they were just accidents, but the locals knew better. Scary stories of a maniac roaming the city at night spread quickly, and the popular imagination filled them with horrifying details. Dan, a local journalist, couldn't stay away. He had a keen sense for stories, and he sensed that something was amiss here. He began his own investigation, scouring the town for clues and interviewing locals. After spending several weeks looking for answers, Dan found nothing but fear and suspicion. One night, however, as he sat in his house working on the material, he noticed a figure in the street. It was a man dressed in a dark coat with a hood draped over his face. He looked suspicious, and Dan decided to follow him. He began to follow him through the streets, keeping to the shadows and trying not to attract attention. The man led him to an abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. Dan, looking around cautiously, followed him inside. Inside it was dark and stinky, and the walls were covered with mold and graffiti. On one of the walls, Dan noticed something strange: a large black circle painted with paint. Inside the circle were illegible symbols. He took his phone and took a picture of them. But at that moment, he heard a sound behind him. When he turned around, he saw a hooded man standing right in front of him. A dark veil was covering his face. In one hand, he held a large knife, gleaming in the dim light. "Who are you?" Dan barely exhaled, trying to hide his fear. "Your worst nightmare," the man replied in a quiet, ominous voice. Dan tried to run, but the man was faster. He lunged at Dan with a knife, but Dan dodged and kicked him. The man fell, and Dan fled the building, heading straight for the police station. When Dan told the police about his encounter with the hooded man, they were skeptical at first. But when he showed pictures from the wall of the abandoned factory, they began to take him seriously. The police organized a search operation to search the building, but when they arrived, it was empty. But Dan wasn't about to give up. He continued his investigation, hoping to find more clues that would help him solve the mystery of this maniac. He searched the library for answers, looking through old newspapers and historical documents, looking for any clues that might shed light on this man. Eventually, after hours of research, he came across an old newspaper article. It told of a local artist who had been accused of a series of murders in the late 19th century. His name was Jonathan Hagel, and he was known for his dark and strange drawings, similar to those Dan had seen in the abandoned factory. With this new information, Dan went back to the police. He showed them the article and linked it to the disappearances and murders. The police finally took him seriously and began investigating. Dan continued to gather evidence and follow the man in the hood. He began watching his house and kept a constant night watch, hoping to spot something suspicious. One night, he noticed the hooded man leave the house and walk toward an abandoned factory. Dan followed him, this time armed with a gun. When they arrived at the abandoned factory, the man went inside. Dan followed him, sneaking quietly inside. This time, he was ready to face the maniac. Inside, he saw a man standing in front of a large black circle on the wall. He said something in an incomprehensible language, and the circle on the wall glowed bright red. The light was so bright that Dan covered his eyes. When he opened them, the man had disappeared, leaving behind him only a circle on the wall, which now looked like a portal to another world. With terror in his heart, Dan decided to follow him. He sighed, pulled himself together, and entered the portal. He found himself in another place that looked like a city, but there was something strange. Everything was painted black and gray, as if color had lost its meaning. Dan began to look for the hooded man, making his way through the ominous streets of this gloomy city. Soon he saw him standing in front of a huge temple-like building. The man went inside, and Dan followed him. Inside the temple it was dark and cold. In the center stood an altar with candles and symbols similar to those he had seen in the abandoned factory. A man was standing in front of the altar, whispering something and holding a metal brooch. At that moment, Dan knew he had to act. He pulled out his gun and pointed it at the man, shouting, "Police! Hands up!" The man slowly turned around. The hood slid from his head, and Dan saw his face. It was Jonathan Hagel, the maniac he was looking for. Hagel smiled, his eyes sparkling with madness. "Too late, detective," he said, and tapped the brooch in his hands. At that moment, something changed. The air around Hagel began to vibrate and his body began to distort. He began to look like a demonic creature with long fangs and eyes glowing bright red. Despite his fear, Dan fired his gun. The bullet pierced Hagel, but it did not stop him. It lunged at Dan, but he dodged and fired again, this time hitting the monster in the head. Hagel fell to the floor and his body took human form again. There was an expression of horror and surprise on his face. "Impossible," he whispered, before his eyes faded and he died. Dan looked around. The temple began to shake and disintegrate. He quickly ran up to the portal and back to the abandoned factory. There he found police officers who arrived on the scene after his call. They were shocked by his story, but the sight of the murdered Hagel and the strange circle on the wall made them believe him. So, the maniac was defeated, and Dan became the town's hero. But he will never forget that terrifying night when he came face to face with real evil.